My best friend's mother pulled me aside and whispered, "There's something I've hidden for years, and you deserve to know the truth." What she said next changed my life forever. Part 1. The conversation that changed everything. I had been going to Ethan's house for so many years that it felt almost like a second home. By 24, I could walk through the front door without needing directions to anything. I knew where the snacks were kept, which floorboards creaked, and how every room looked when sunlight poured through the windows in the afternoon. Most of all, I knew his mother. Linda had always been one of those people who made everyone feel comfortable. She had a calm presence that seemed to settle a room the moment she entered it. Friends gravitated toward her during gatherings. Neighbors stopped to chat whenever they saw her outside, and even complete strangers seemed to trust her within minutes. That evening, Ethan's family was hosting a small backyard barbecue. Nothing unusual. A few relatives, some neighbors, and a handful of friends gathered beneath strings of warm lights hanging across the yard. Laughter drifted through the summer air while music played softly in the background. Yet something felt different. I couldn't explain it at first. Everything around me appeared normal, but every time I glanced toward Linda, I caught a look on her face that didn't belong there. She smiled when people spoke to her. She laughed at jokes. She helped serve food and checked on guests. But the smiles never quite reached her eyes. Several times throughout the evening, I noticed her staring into the distance when she thought nobody was watching. The moment someone approached, she would quickly compose herself and return to the version of herself everyone expected to see. At first I assumed she was tired. Then I started wondering if something was wrong. As the evening continued, I found myself paying more attention to her than I intended. Not because of attraction or curiosity, but because genuine concern had begun to grow inside me. Near sunset, while everyone else was distracted by conversation, our eyes met across the yard. For a brief second, something passed between us. A hesitation, a silent question, almost as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the right moment. The feeling stayed with me. Hours later, guests began leaving. Chairs were folded. Empty plates disappeared into the kitchen. The energy of the gathering slowly faded until only a handful of people remained. I helped Ethan carry a cooler into the garage before grabbing my keys. "See you tomorrow," I told him. As I started toward the front door, a voice stopped me. "Could you stay for a minute?" I turned around. Linda stood in the hallway. For some reason, her expression immediately made my stomach tighten. "Sure," I said. She glanced toward the living room to make sure nobody was nearby. "Actually," she said softly, "could we talk somewhere private?" The request caught me off guard. In all the years I had known her, she had never asked me for a private conversation. Not once. I followed her into the kitchen. The house suddenly felt unusually quiet. The distant sounds of conversation faded as she closed the door behind us. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. She stood beside the counter, fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since gone cold. Then she looked up at me. There was nervousness in her eyes. Real nervousness. The kind that comes from carrying something heavy for far too long. Before I could ask what was wrong, she took a slow breath. "There's something I've needed to tell you for a very long time," she said. And in that moment, I knew whatever came next was going to change everything. Part 2. A secret buried for years. For several seconds after she spoke, the kitchen felt completely silent. I stood across from Linda, trying to make sense of the nervous expression on her face. This wasn't the confident woman I had known for years. The woman standing in front of me now looked as though she had been carrying an invisible weight for a very long time. She lowered herself into one of the kitchen chairs and stared down at the cold coffee in her hands. "You don't have to say anything right away," she said quietly. "I just need you to listen." I nodded. The seriousness in her voice erased any temptation to interrupt. She took a slow breath before beginning. "Years ago, I made a decision that seemed right at the time," she said. "At least, that's what I told myself. But the older I've gotten, the more I've questioned whether I did the right thing." I watched her carefully. Every word appeared difficult for her to say. The lines around her eyes seemed deeper than usual, as though years of regret had settled there. "What kind of decision?" I finally asked. She hesitated. The question lingered between us. Then she gave a small, sad smile. "The kind that changes several lives at once." I felt my stomach tighten. Linda wasn't speaking dramatically. She wasn't trying to shock me. If anything, she sounded exhausted, like someone who had replayed the same memories thousands of times. She slowly explained that many years earlier, Circumstances had forced her to choose between protecting someone she cared about and revealing a painful truth that would have hurt multiple people. At the time, she had convinced herself that silence was the kinder option. But silence had consequences. The truth never disappeared. Simply waited. Waiting through birthdays. Waiting through holidays. Waiting through countless ordinary moments. Every year that passed made it harder to finally speak about it. I kept telling myself I'd tell the truth eventually, she admitted. Then months became years. The sadness in her voice hit me harder than I expected. For the first time, I wasn't looking at my friend's mother. I was looking at a person wrestling with regret. A person who had spent years wondering if she had done more harm than good. The realization made me feel unexpectedly protective. Linda had always seemed strong. The kind of person who had everything figured out. Yet sitting there under the warm kitchen lights, she looked vulnerable in a way I had never seen before. She rubbed her thumb against the side of the coffee mug. A small nervous habit. I wondered how many nights she had sat alone in the same kitchen thinking about the secret she was finally revealing. "Why tell me now?" I asked gently, her eyes lifted toward mine. For a moment, neither of us looked away. "Because you've grown into someone I trust," she said. The answer surprised me, not because of what she said, because of how sincerely she said it. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just honesty. A strange warmth settled in my chest. I had come to the house expecting an ordinary evening. Now I was sitting across from someone sharing one of the most difficult truths of her life. As the conversation continued, she revealed pieces of a story I had never known existed. Pieces that connected to people I thought I understood. Pieces that reshaped memories I had accepted as facts. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't a story about betrayal. It was a story about sacrifice, about fear, about trying to protect people and living with the consequences afterward. When she finally finished speaking, the room fell silent again. The clock on the wall ticked softly. Neither of us seemed eager to break the silence. My mind struggled to process everything I had heard. Linda looked emotionally drained. Yet there was also relief on her face, as if speaking the truth had loosened a burden she had carried for years. Eventually, I stood to leave. She walked me to the front door. When I stepped outside, the cool night air hit my face. But my thoughts remained inside that kitchen, inside that conversation, inside the secret she had trusted me with. Driving home, I barely noticed the roads in front of me. One question kept repeating in my mind. If this truth had been hidden for so long, what else had I never seen? And why did I suddenly find myself thinking about Linda long after the secret itself had been told? Part 3. Seeing her differently, the days following our conversation felt strangely different. At first, I thought it was because of the secret itself. Anyone would have been shaken after hearing something that changed the way they viewed years of memories. Yet as the week went on, I realized the truth wasn't the only thing occupying my thoughts. It was Linda, not in the way most people would assume. I wasn't replaying her appearance or imagining some dramatic romance. What stayed with me was the vulnerability she had shown that night. For the first time since I had known her, I had seen beyond the confident smile she always wore. I had seen the person underneath. The woman who carried regrets. The woman who doubted herself. The woman who sometimes felt alone despite spending most of her life taking care of everyone around her. A few days later, I stopped by Ethan's house to return something I had borrowed. Ethan wasn't home. "He's out running errands," Linda explained when she answered the door. I should have left. Instead, she smiled lightly and said, "You can come in for a few minutes if you'd like." I found myself accepting without much thought. Soon we were sitting on the back porch, each holding a cup of coffee, while the afternoon sun slowly dipped lower in the sky. The conversation started casually. Work, family, life, nothing unusual. But unlike previous years, the walls between us seemed thinner now. Neither of us was pretending anymore. At one point, she laughed softly after telling a story about a mistake she had made at work. "I used to think adults eventually figured everything out," she admitted. I smiled. "You're telling me they don't?" She shook her head. "Not even close." The laugh we shared felt easy, natural, and somehow more meaningful than it should have. As the weeks passed, conversations like that became more common. Sometimes I'd stop by when Ethan was home. Sometimes we'd end up talking after everyone else left the room. Sometimes we'd simply find ourselves sitting together during family gatherings while conversations drifted around us. What surprised me most was how much I enjoyed those moments. Linda had lived a life full of experiences I hadn't yet reached. She spoke about mistakes she wished she could undo, dreams she once had, opportunities she had let pass by because responsibilities came first. Listening to her felt different from talking with anyone else. There was honesty in her words. No pretending. No trying to impress anyone. Just truth. One evening we sat outside after sunset. The backyard was quiet except for the distant sound of crickets. For several minutes neither of us spoke. Surprisingly, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Felt peaceful. At one point our shoulders brushed lightly as we shifted in our chairs. The contact lasted only a second. Yet somehow I noticed it immediately. So did she. Neither of us acknowledged it. But neither moved away. Instead, she continued staring toward the darkening sky. You know, she said quietly, I haven't talked to someone this openly in a very long time. Something about her voice made my chest tighten. Not because she sounded sad. Because she sounded relieved. I turned toward her. The porch light cast a soft glow across her face. For a moment, she looked less like the woman everyone depended on and more like someone who simply wanted to be understood. Someone tired of carrying everything alone. Without thinking, I said, I'm glad you told me. Her eyes met mine. The look she gave me was gentle, grateful, and far more personal than anything we had ever shared before. Me too, she said softly. The words were simple, yet neither of us looked away immediately afterward. Something lingered in the silence. Not a confession. Not attraction. At least not yet. Just an awareness that our connection was becoming something deeper than either of us had expected. As I drove home later that night, I realized something that made me uneasy. The secret she had revealed weeks ago no longer occupied most of my thoughts. Instead, I kept thinking about our conversations. Her laughter, her honesty, the comfort I felt around her. And for the first time, I found myself looking forward to seeing her again. That realization stayed with me long after the porch lights disappeared in my rearview mirror. Part 4 feelings neither wants to admit. By the time autumn arrived, talking to Linda had become one of the most natural parts of my week. What had started as a conversation built around a secret had quietly grown into something neither of us could have predicted. We talked about everything now. Books she was reading, projects at work, memories from her childhood, my plans for the future, the fears we rarely admitted to anyone else. The strange thing was that neither of us ever planned these conversations. They simply happened. A quick visit would somehow turn into an hour on the porch. A simple text would become a long exchange that lasted until midnight. The connection felt effortless. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. At least that's what I began telling myself. One evening I arrived at Ethan's house to help him move some furniture into the garage. We spent most of the afternoon working, laughing, and complaining about how much heavier everything felt than it looked. By sunset, Ethan left to meet some friends. I stayed behind to finish cleaning up. Linda was outside gathering cushions from the patio furniture before the weather turned colder. Without thinking, I walked over to help. Thanks, she said with a smile. Together we carried the cushions toward the storage shed. At one point she lost her grip on one of them. Instinctively I reached out. My hand closed around hers. For a second, neither of us moved. The contact was brief, completely innocent, yet it felt strangely significant. Her skin was warm from being outside. I could feel the slight tension in her fingers before she gently pulled her hand away. Neither of us mentioned it. But something had changed. The silence that followed felt different, more noticeable, more complicated. That night, after we finished putting everything away, we sat on the porch as we had done countless times before. The air carried the crisp scent of approaching winter. A cool breeze moved through the trees, while distant porch lights glowed across the neighborhood. Normally conversation flowed easily between us. Tonight it didn't. Both of us seemed unusually aware of each other's presence. Every glance lingered a little longer. Every pause stretched a little further. I found myself noticing details I had ignored before. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear while listening. The warmth in her eyes whenever she smiled. The quiet elegance she carried without ever trying to draw attention to herself. The realization unsettled me, because for the first time I couldn't pretend my feelings were purely friendship. At the same time, I knew the situation was complicated. Linda wasn't just someone I cared about. She was my best friend's mother. The thought alone filled me with guilt. I hated myself for even questioning boundaries that had always seemed so clear. For days afterward, I tried convincing myself that I was imagining things, that the tension I felt existed only in my head. Then Linda started pulling away. The change was subtle at first. She replied to messages a little later than usual. Conversations ended sooner. She found reasons to stay busy whenever I visited. Nothing rude, nothing obvious, just enough for me to notice, and enough for it to hurt. One evening, after nearly a week of barely speaking, I stopped by unexpectedly. She answered the door with the same kind smile she always wore, yet I could immediately tell something was wrong. "Have I done something?" I asked before I could stop myself. Her expression softened. For a moment she looked genuinely sad. "No," she said quietly. "Then why does it feel like you're avoiding me?" She lowered her eyes. The silence that followed gave me my answer long before she spoke. When she finally looked back at me, there was vulnerability in her gaze. And something else. Something neither of us wanted to name. "Because this friendship has become important to me," she admitted softly. My heartbeat quickened. She looked away toward the dark street. "And that scares me." Neither of us spoke after that. We didn't need to. The truth was already hanging between us. For months we had been building a connection neither of us expected. Now we were standing at the edge of feelings neither of us knew how to handle. And for the first time I realized she was struggling just as much as I was. Part 5. The distance that hurts. After that conversation at the front door, everything changed. Not dramatically. Not overnight. There were no arguments. No harsh words. No emotional scene that marked the beginning of our distance. In some ways, that made it harder. Linda simply stepped back. And I let her. At first, I told myself it was probably for the best. We had both acknowledged, without directly saying it, that our connection had become more complicated than either of us intended. Creating some space seemed like the responsible thing to do. At least, that's what I kept repeating to myself. The problem was that knowing something is necessary doesn't make it hurt any less. The following week felt unusually long. I found myself reaching for my phone several times a day, only to remember there were no new messages waiting for me. Conversations that had once happened naturally were suddenly gone. The absence was impossible to ignore. What surprised me most was how deeply I felt it. Before meeting Linda on this level, I had always considered myself independent. I had friends, work, hobbies, and plans for the future. My life wasn't empty. Yet now there was a quiet space inside my routine that felt impossible to fill. A space she had somehow occupied without either of us realizing it. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan invited me over to watch a game. I accepted immediately. Part of me wanted to see him. Another part hoped I might accidentally see Linda. The moment I arrived, I realized how much I had missed her presence. She was moving around the kitchen while Ethan and I sat in the living room. Nothing unusual. Nothing intimate. Yet every glimpse of her made my chest tighten. The worst part was how normal she acted. She smiled, asked how work was going, offered snacks, spoke with the same kindness she always had. But there was distance now, carefulness, as though she had built an invisible wall and was determined not to let either of us cross it. I hated how much I noticed, and I hated how much it bothered me. A few days later, I found myself driving home from work when I passed a small coffee shop Linda had once mentioned loving. Without warning, I remembered one of our conversations there. The way she had laughed after spilling coffee on herself while telling a story. The way her eyes had crinkled when she smiled. The memory hit me so unexpectedly that I actually pulled into the parking lot. Not because I wanted coffee, because for a brief moment, I wanted to feel close to those memories again. Sitting alone by the window, I finally admitted something I had been avoiding for weeks. I missed her. Not the idea of her. Not the excitement of forbidden feelings. Her. The conversations. The honesty. The comfort. The sense that she understood parts of me I rarely showed anyone else. That realization stayed with me long after I left. As the weeks continued, the distance between us remained. But something else happened. Instead of weakening my feelings, the separation strengthened them. Without our regular conversations, I began noticing all the ways she had become part of my life. Certain songs reminded me of stories she'd told. Certain places reminded me of afternoons we'd spent talking. Even ordinary moments seemed connected to her somehow. One evening, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through old messages. Nothing romantic. Nothing dramatic. Just months of conversations filled with encouragement, laughter, and honesty. Looking at them made me realize how rare our connection truly was, and how much I had taken it for granted. A message window sat open on my screen. For several minutes, I stared at it. I thought about typing something, anything. Instead, I locked my phone and set it aside, because deep down, I knew this wasn't something a text could fix. The next morning, I woke with a strange sense of clarity. For weeks, I had been trying to convince myself that distance would make my feelings disappear. It hadn't. If anything, it had revealed how real those feelings actually were. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether I cared about Linda. I already knew the answer. The real question was whether I was willing to fight for a connection that complicated. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized I was no longer afraid of what I felt. I was only afraid of losing her completely. Part 6: Truth, Vulnerability, and Choice. By the time nearly a month had passed, the distance between us had become impossible to ignore. The strange thing was that life kept moving forward. I still went to work. I still spent time with friends. I still saw Ethan regularly. From the outside, everything looked normal. But underneath that normal routine was a constant awareness of someone missing. Every conversation felt a little shorter. Every day felt a little quieter. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop comparing every connection in my life to the one I had with Linda. One Friday evening, Ethan mentioned that he would be away for the weekend visiting relatives. The information shouldn't have mattered, yet somehow it stayed in my mind. Later that night, as I sat alone in my apartment, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen. My heart immediately skipped. It was Linda. The message was simple. Asterisk, would you mind stopping by tomorrow? I'd like to talk. Asterisk, for several seconds, I stared at the words. Then I replied. Asterisk, of course. Asterisk, the next afternoon felt longer than it should have. By the time I arrived, clouds hung low across the sky, and a cool breeze moved through the neighborhood. Linda opened the door before I even had a chance to knock. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It had only been a few weeks, yet it felt much longer. She stepped aside. Come in. The house was unusually quiet. Without Ethan there, the familiar rooms felt different somehow. More personal. More intimate. We ended up sitting on the back porch where so many of our conversations had taken place before. For a while, neither of us knew how to begin. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with everything that had gone unsaid. Finally, Linda broke it. I owe you an apology. I looked at her. For what? For disappearing. The sadness in her voice was impossible to miss. She folded her hands together and stared toward the yard. I thought creating distance would solve everything. I stayed quiet, letting her continue. She took a slow breath. The truth is, I wasn't trying to protect myself. She paused. I was trying to protect everyone else. The words settled heavily between us. I already knew what she meant. The friendship, the feelings, the complications surrounding both. Linda looked down for several moments before speaking again. I spent weeks telling myself that stepping away was the responsible thing to do. A small laugh escaped her, one without any real humor. And every single day, I missed talking to you. My chest tightened. Hearing the words spoken aloud made them feel real in a way they never had before. For the first time since this all began, neither of us was hiding behind careful language. Neither of us was pretending. I missed you too, I admitted quietly. Her eyes met mine. The honesty there made looking away impossible. The afternoon sunlight softened the edges of her face. For a moment, she looked vulnerable in a way I'd never seen before. Not because she was weak, because she had finally stopped protecting herself. I was afraid, she confessed. Of what? A faint smile appeared. Everything. I couldn't help smiling slightly. That's a pretty long list. This time her laugh was genuine. Brief. Warm. Then her expression softened again. People's opinions. The consequences. The possibility of hurting someone I care about. She hesitated. And maybe the possibility of getting hurt myself. The vulnerability in that admission struck me deeply. For months I had viewed Linda as someone who always had the answers. Someone who carried herself with certainty. Now I realized she had been struggling with the same fears I had. The same doubts. The same sleepless nights. Without thinking, I reached for her hand resting on the arm of the chair. This time neither of us pulled away. Her fingers curled gently around mine. The contact felt simple. Yet somehow it carried months of unspoken emotion. Neither of us rushed to fill the silence. We simply sat there, hands joined, letting the truth exist between us. Finally, I spoke. I don't know what happens next. Neither do I. But I know pretending this connection doesn't matter isn't working. She looked at me for a long moment, then slowly nodded. A trace of emotion appeared in her eyes. The kind that comes when someone finally stops fighting what they already know. For months we had been circling around the truth. Now it stood openly between us. No excuses. No avoidance. No distance. Just honesty. Linda's thumb brushed lightly across my knuckles. A small gesture, but one filled with affection. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said the words I had been carrying in my heart for weeks. I feel it too. In that moment, neither of us had all the answers. But for the first time, we had something even more important. The courage to stop hiding from the truth. Part 7, a future built on honesty. Looking back now, I realized the hardest part wasn't admitting how we felt. It was deciding what came afterward. Feelings were simple. Life wasn't. The weeks following our conversation on the porch were filled with long discussions, careful decisions, and more honesty than either of us had ever expected to share with another person. Neither Linda nor I wanted to build something meaningful on secrecy. Too many important moments in our lives had already been shaped by things left unsaid. We weren't going to repeat that mistake. So instead of rushing forward, we took our time. We talked about everything. The challenges, the questions, the opinions people might have, the uncertainty that naturally came with choosing a path neither of us had planned. Some conversations lasted for hours. Others ended in thoughtful silence. But every discussion brought us closer together. Not because we always agreed, because we were learning how to face difficult truths side by side. That became the foundation of everything. Trust, patience, honesty. Months passed. Slowly, the fear that had once surrounded us began to fade. Not completely, but enough. Enough to stop letting it control our decisions. One evening, after a long day at work, I stopped by the house. The same house I had visited countless times over the years. Yet somehow it felt different now. Not unfamiliar, just filled with new meaning. Linda was sitting on the back porch when I arrived. A light blanket rested across her lap while the setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and orange. When she saw me walking toward her, her face immediately brightened. That simple reaction never stopped affecting me, no matter how many times it happened. He sat beside her, close enough that our shoulders touched naturally. Neither of us moved away. The comfort between us had replaced the uncertainty that once existed. For a while we simply watched the sunset. The evening air was cool. Birds drifted across the sky in the distance. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, peaceful. Eventually, Linda leaned slightly toward me. Her head came to rest gently against my shoulder. The gesture felt effortless, natural, as though it belonged there. I felt the soft weight of her resting beside me and smiled. Months earlier, a moment like this would have felt impossible. Now it felt like home. My hand found hers resting beneath the blanket. Our fingers intertwined comfortably. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just closeness. The kind built slowly through trust rather than excitement. Do you ever think about how strange all of this is? She asked softly. I laughed. All the time. She smiled. Me too. For a moment we sat quietly. Then she turned slightly to look at me. There was warmth in her eyes. The same warmth that had first drawn me toward her during those long conversations months ago. Only now it wasn't hidden behind walls or fear. It was open, certain, real. Thank you, she said. I frowned slightly. For what? For seeing me. The answer caught me off guard. She continued before I could respond. For seeing more than the role everyone expected me to play. Emotion tightened in my chest, because I understood exactly what she meant. For years, people had seen Linda as someone's mother, someone's neighbor, someone responsible, someone dependable. All true, but she was also so much more than that. A woman with dreams, regrets, strength, vulnerability. A person deserving of love and understanding just like anyone else. I squeezed her hand gently. You never had to earn that. Her smile softened, the kind of smile that reaches all the way to the eyes. As darkness slowly settled across the neighborhood, we remained on the porch where so much of our story had unfolded. The place where secrets had been shared, where fears had been confessed, where distance had been overcome, and where something unexpected had quietly grown into love. The secret Linda revealed that night in the kitchen had once felt like the most important thing in my life. Now I understood it was only the beginning, because the truth that changed everything wasn't the one she carried for years. It was the one we eventually discovered together. Sometimes the most meaningful relationships appear when you least expect them. Not through grand gestures, not through perfect timing, but through honesty, patience, and the courage to truly know another person. As I sat there with her beneath the evening sky, her hand resting comfortably in mine, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: peace. And for the first time since this journey began, I wasn't wondering what came next. I was simply grateful for where we had arrived. Together,